When I was 7, my mother decided she didn't want to be a mother anymore, so she sent me to Montreal to live with my dad that I didn't know. My dad had been a petty criminal as a child in the 1930s. He worked sneaking into windows for older, hardened criminals. He left school in grade 3 and was in prison when he was 11 years old. As an adult, he worked as a janitor, but he saw himself as street smart. He had a little silver transistor radio that he attached to his belt while he mopped up the floors. This kept him abreast of the news. He listened to it so often that he assumed he must be as intelligent as the most intelligent people were. My dad was determined to take care of me properly. He made me pancakes and cookies and sewed my clothes. He was actually really good at that. What he was a little worse at was what he regarded as an integral part of parenting, the dispensing of life advice. But nonetheless, it was one of his favorite things to do. He liked spending time with me because I had to look up with him. I was only 7. He treated me as though I was his junior partner. He had several rules that he was quite passionate about. The first was that I never keep a diary. I had been given a journal when I was 6 years old by an uncle, and I loved the feeling of chronicling my events in the black journal. But my dad was adamant that I knock it off. He told me it was a terrible habit because everything I wrote in the diary would ultimately be used against me in court. He thought everyone ended up in court as a rite of passage. But I wonder whether he felt exposed, as though I would be able to return to these as an adult and then judge what he had done in his behavior. But no matter how many journals he threw out, I would continue to write in them. I'm writing in one now. Another rule he had was that one should learn to play the tuba. My dad was insistent for years that when I got to middle school, I played the tuba. My dad said that the world didn't have enough tuba players and you could always get a job if you played one. I was very worried about being able to earn a living, so if I was just allowed to play the tuba in music class, my problems would already be over when I was only 11. There were girls in my class that told me that I had to face it. I was too skinny to play the tuba and that I was always given to the fattest kid. But I was so sure I could hold it. I thought it would be like having a baby elephant in my lap all the time, and that seemed like such a good thing. I looked at the tuba with such longing and desire, as though it were a fat millionaire in a tailored suit who could take care of me for the rest of my life. But there was only one tuba, and it was given to a really big boy. Instead, I was given a trumpet. I always wept playing the trumpet for the first 3 months. The teacher said there was a peculiar sadness to the way I played. I earned an A in music class, although I didn't think I deserved it. Another rule of his was that one should never share their scientific research. I told my dad how in class we were allowed to choose a partner for a project on the solar system. My dad lost it. He said my partner would steal my research and pass it off as their own. Then they would go on to be famous and I would be penniless. So reluctantly, I told the teacher that I didn't want to have a partner. But I didn't feel good about it at all. And all the information that I got about Jupiter, I had copied pretty much directly from a set of encyclopedias that were on the shelf in the school library. I couldn't imagine making any great breakthroughs about the planet that a partner could win the Nobel Prize with. One of my favorite segments on The Muppet Show was Pigs in Space. It seemed so much fun to go into outer space. It would be like you got to go on a sleepover party that lasted for 3 years and wear your pajamas all the time and eat TV dinners. But it wouldn't be fun alone, especially not if you encountered alien life forms. I saw myself on a planet filling up empty jars with sample mushrooms and snails, and 8 quadrillion stars turning on and off over my head. The little prince had tried to live as a bachelor, and he had ended up going mad and entering into a masochistic relationship with a rose. You had to share your research, I decided. So I teamed up with a girl named Carolyn. She had a photocopy machine in her house, and I was so infatuated with that machine. I loved when teachers handed out newly photocopied pages. I would smell them as though they were cocaine. It was like marker, but not marker. Carolyn and I stood there and photocopied random things, and I watched the light of the machine move back and forth as though it were the aurora borealis. And even if she did turn against me and take credit for my ideas about Jupiter, being betrayed was worse than being alone. Another one of my dad's commandments was that I must hang out and pay attention what the Jewish kids were doing. He had grown up in a working-class neighborhood in Montreal that was filled with French Canadians like him and Jewish kids. The Jewish kids had lived in apartments next to him. They had come to play with him in their pea caps and dirty undershirts and had swam in the river and cursed and laughed with him. But then the Jews all went on to high school and university. They left the neighborhood and did interesting things with themselves. The Jews who grew up in Montreal during the Depression were a marvelous and magically upward mobile class. They had somehow got ahead of him, so he was adamant that I figure out what the hell they'd done. I made a friend in class named Ezra. He wore Adidas shorts and gym socks up to his knees every day. I went over to his house. He had purchased a walkie-talkie and would stay up late chatting with truck drivers. They would have a lot of time on their hands and listen to his problems. He was saving all his paper route money because he really wanted to go to therapy. He loved the idea of it. He had asked his parents, and they said they wouldn't pay for it because there was nothing wrong with him. I'm not exactly sure what I learned from Ezra, but he was a wonderful pal. Another rule of my dad's was that we must hate Paul Newman. My dad said he didn't care how many people agreed that Paul Newman was a magnificent actor. This was not the case at all. My dad talked about Paul Newman as though he had stolen his life. My dad had been quite handsome when he was young, but hadn't been able to trade in on it. My dad also thought that his salad dressing was the very best in the world, and he had never made a cent off it. The way that my dad talked about Paul Newman made it seem as though they must have known each other. Only a long-term grievance could motivate this kind of rancor. For a period in my life, I thought that Paul Newman was from Montreal, that he had grown up on St. Urban Street and gone to Barrenbing High School with my dad. I kept expecting Paul Newman to pop up in family photos. I didn't really understand that American movie stars lived in New York or Hollywood. I thought they all just lived downtown near where the Megaplex movie theaters were. Sometimes the doorbell would ring out of the blue and we would get terrified, and I would think it was Paul Newman at the door, come to stir things up, come to open old wounds. Or that we might run into Paul Newman at the Canada Day parade, eating red and white cake with a plastic spoon, and that all hell would break loose. Whenever I brought up that Paul Newman was a terrible actor, my friends' parents looked at me completely shocked. They had a look on their face as though they didn't know who I was. But my dad and I held up our ginger ale glasses and clinked them together and said, "Not to Paul Newman." There was, however, a repertory theater right across the street from our house. And my dad was friends with the guy who ran it and would always get me free tickets. Then one afternoon, when I was 13, I walked in and saw the movie The Hustler. There I was in the darkness, all alone with Paul Newman. He was so charming and tortured and clever and hapless. How could I not love him? Paul Newman was made to be loved. Perhaps my dad thought if he could keep me away from Paul Newman, he could keep me away from the disappointments of being an adult, the perspective that adulthood usually brings that you will never achieve all of your dreams. You will probably not grow up to be the important person that you wanted to be. I didn't tell my dad that I thought Paul Newman was a wonderful actor. I was the one person in the world who believed that he was better than Paul Newman. I still, however, have never tried Paul Newman's salad dressing out of respect. I broke all the rules that my dad gave me, but they gave me a context for life. They made life seem exciting. They gave me a sense that everything I did was important, and I carried that notion through my life. I was a happy child, and I liked having a rule book to follow, even though it was absurd. And most of my favorite times happened when he wasn't giving me any advice at all, when we would stop and look at different soup bowls on the shelves in the window of the Polish grocery store. All those wonderful days when we would just totally forget ourselves and we would not have to know any of the 100 rules that you have to know in order to get by. We would just forget about everything and decide to be happy losers. We would go to the city zoo. We would applaud the baby elephant. In my memory, the baby elephant is always having a dump. And sometimes in my dreams, the elephant is sitting on my lap. Thank you.